Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away, and nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually feeling. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way. If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again." So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want you to picture something for me. You're standing in a Canadian winter, and it's not the postcard kind, not the kind with pristine snow and warm light coming through a frosted window while something smells like cinnamon inside. It's the other kind. The February kind, where the wind comes off the lake at an angle that feels personal, where the sky is the exact same shade of gray it was yesterday and will be tomorrow, and you're standing in a parking lot outside a restaurant supply warehouse looking at a shipment of boxes that were supposed to arrive on Tuesday and are now somehow arriving on a Thursday afternoon in a snowstorm. And your phone is ringing with 3 separate calls you haven't answered yet, and you have a flight to Manila booked for Saturday that you are increasingly certain you are not going to make, and somewhere in the back of your head, a version of your life that you planned very carefully is quietly, steadily falling apart. That's not a crisis. I want to be honest about that from the start. That's just a Thursday if you run a small business in 2 countries and tell yourself for long enough that the math is going to work out. My name is Wyatt Hughes. I'm 58 years old. I was born in Vancouver, built a business in Toronto, fell in love with the Philippines in my early 40s on what was supposed to be a 2-week vacation, and spent the better part of 6 years trying to live in both places at once before the reality of what I'd actually built and what it actually cost me forced me to make a decision I'd been avoiding with extraordinary creativity for longer than I'm entirely proud of. If stories like this are the kind of thing that matter to you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, and I think you'll want to be there for it. I should back up and explain what I mean by falling in love with a place, because I don't want to oversell the romance of it or make it sound like something that happened to me rather than something I actively chose, repeatedly, over years, every time I had an opportunity to choose differently. I first went to the Philippines in 2007. I was 41 years old, newly divorced, the owner of a catering supply business I'd been running out of Toronto for 11 years, and a friend of mine named Dennis, who'd been going to Cebu for years to visit family, finally wore me down enough that I agreed to tag along on one of his trips. I want to be clear that I had no particular curiosity about Southeast Asia at that point in my life. I'd been to Mexico a few times, once to London on a work trip, twice to New York. That was the approximate scope of my international imagination. I was a man who ran a business, paid a mortgage, drove a sensible car, and took 2 weeks off in July if things were quiet enough to allow it. The Philippines wasn't on any version of my radar that existed before Dennis started talking about it. We landed in Cebu on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon I was sitting on a small balcony at a guest house, watching the light change on the water, and feeling something I can only describe as a kind of depressurization. The way a room feels after you've been in loud noise for so long, you stopped hearing it as noise, and then suddenly it stops, and you can hear what silence actually sounds like. Toronto in 2007 was not, objectively, a bad city to live in. I want to be clear about that. But I'd been running my business through a difficult expansion. I was about 14 months out of my divorce. I hadn't had a real conversation with another human being that wasn't about inventory or invoicing in what felt like months. And sitting on that balcony on a Thursday afternoon, with nothing required of me for the first time in longer than I could pinpoint, I felt something physically loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was clenched. Dennis was a patient tour guide, not pushy, not evangelical about the place the way some people get when they discover a destination they want everyone to love as much as they do. He just showed me things and let me react honestly. We went to Kawasan Falls on the second day, a waterfall tucked into a canyon with water so cold and so clear it looked manufactured. The kind of blue you expect to see in a screensaver, and not in an actual canyon you've hiked into yourself. We ate at a carinderia in a small side street in Cebu City, where the woman running it wouldn't take no for an answer about the amount of food she put in front of us. And I ate more in that single sitting than I'd eaten in probably 3 days combined back home. Because I'd been living on coffee and expediency for months, and I'd completely forgotten what it felt like to actually sit down and eat something, prepared by someone who cared whether you liked it. I went back to Toronto after that trip and thought about the Philippines for 3 solid weeks before I admitted to myself that I was thinking about it. Then I went back. 6 months later, booked it myself, different island this time. Went to Palawan, on the advice of a forum I'd found at 2 in the morning, stayed for 10 days in a small place near El Nido, kayaked through limestone formations that looked like they belonged in a geography textbook, about a planet that wasn't this one. Had a conversation at dinner one night with a retired couple from Australia who'd been splitting their time between Melbourne and Puerto Princesa for 4 years. Who described the arrangement with a casualness that made it sound entirely achievable, like something a normal person could do if they thought about it carefully and didn't overcomplicate it. I remember the exact moment the idea crystallized. I was sitting on a beach watching the sun go down behind one of the limestone islands, the sky going orange in that particular way that only happens when you're actually far enough from ambient light pollution to see what a sunset is supposed to look like. And I thought, almost as a test of my own reaction, what if this wasn't a vacation? What if this was just where part of my life happened? My reaction to that thought was not fear. That's the part I should have paid more attention to. A reasonable man with a business and a mortgage and a life that had some complexity to it might have felt a twinge of anxiety at that thought, might have immediately started calculating what it would actually cost or require. What I felt instead was something close to relief, the immediate, uncomplicated relief of an idea that feels more like a memory than a plan, familiar before it should be. I want to describe the business I'd built, because understanding what I was working with matters for understanding what came next. Wyatt Hughes Supply had started in 1996, initially as a small operation sourcing catering equipment for restaurants and hotels in the Toronto area. Over 11 years, I'd grown it into something with 8 employees, a warehouse in Mississauga, accounts with properties across southern Ontario, and a reasonably reliable, if unglamorous, annual revenue that kept me comfortable, paid the mortgage on a townhouse near High Park I'd been in since my early 30s, and gave me the kind of occupational identity that you don't fully realize you've built your entire self-concept around until someone asks you what you'd be without it. My ex-wife Helen had made an observation during our divorce proceedings, stated without particular cruelty and without any apparent awareness of how precisely accurate it was, that I was married to the business long before I was married to her, and that the divorce she was filing for was really just the second one she'd had to initiate. I didn't argue the point, because I couldn't, not honestly. I'd been a good business owner in all the ways that mattered commercially, and a mediocre husband in nearly all the ways that mattered personally, and the two things were connected in ways I spent a fair amount of time on those early Philippines trips finally starting to examine. By the time I was seriously considering splitting my time between Canada and the Philippines, I'd restructured the business enough that it could theoretically run with less direct daily involvement from me. I had a general manager named Priya, who'd been with me for 6 years, and who was, functionally, more organized than I was, better at the operational detail, calmer under pressure, and genuinely interested in eventually taking on more responsibility. I had systems in place, a small but reliable team, and a client base that was loyal enough to sustain itself without me personally managing every account the way I had in the early years. On paper, the idea of stepping back and spending significant time in another country wasn't obviously insane. On paper, actually, it looked almost sensible if you were the kind of person who trusted paper. I started going back to the Philippines twice a year, then 3 times. I began staying longer each trip. I started exploring different regions, moving from Cebu to Palawan to Siargao to Dumaguete, learning the rhythms of different kinds of places, understanding that the Philippines is not one thing, but many things. Dozens of distinct personalities contained within 7,000 islands. I started learning a little Tagalog, not fluently, not in a way that would impress anyone who spoke it natively, but enough to order food and negotiate a jeepney fare and apologize appropriately when I knocked something over, which I did with some regularity in unfamiliar spaces. In 2013, on a trip to Dumaguete, I met a woman named Clara. I'm going to be careful here, because Clara is not the central character in this particular story, and I want to represent her fairly, rather than flattening her into a narrative device in someone else's account of their own decisions. Clara was a ceramics teacher at a university in Dumaguete, the daughter of a retired physician and a woman who'd run a small handicraft export business for 30 years, and she was sharp and funny and entirely unimpressed by me, in the way that I found immediately clarifying after years of professional relationships where everyone was at least somewhat invested in how I felt about things. She had a particular skill for asking exactly the one question you hadn't prepared an answer for. On our 3rd dinner together, she asked me, with a directness that I would eventually understand was simply her baseline mode of operation rather than any particular pointed intent, what I was actually looking for when I kept coming back here, and whether I'd considered the possibility that I kept leaving before I found it, because leaving was easier than staying long enough to know. I didn't have an answer for that one. I fumbled through something that sounded more like a business pitch than a genuine response, and she listened patiently and then said, "That's not an answer, that's a proposal deck." And I laughed harder than I'd laughed at anything in years, which is when I knew something significant was happening. Clara and I were together for 2 years before we started talking seriously about a shared future, and talking seriously about a shared future meant, inevitably, talking seriously about geography. She had deep roots in Dumaguete, family there, a career she loved, a position at the university she'd spent 15 years building. She wasn't interested in leaving, and she was honest about that from early on, which I respected completely, because at least I knew what the actual question was. The question was whether I could build a life there, alongside hers, rather than just a longer and longer version of an extended visit. We talked about it for months. They came to visit eventually, and I could tell, the moment they landed, that they were nervous about exactly what they were going to find, having spent months imagining a version of my new life that was probably far bleaker than the reality actually turned out to be. I watched them do the thing I think every skeptical loved one does when they finally see something in person instead of hearing about it second-hand over occasional phone calls. The worry on their face slowly gave way, over the course of just a few days, to something closer to relief, and eventually something closer to genuine happiness on my behalf, watching me move through an ordinary day in a life that clearly had real shape and real people in it, not the isolated, uncertain existence they'd apparently been quietly picturing all along. On the last night of that visit, sitting together somewhere quiet, they said something that stayed with me long after they'd flown home. Some version of admitting they'd expected to find someone lonelier, smaller, more diminished than the person actually sitting in front of them. I told them that was more or less exactly what I'd feared finding in myself too, in those uncertain early months, and that I understood completely why they'd worried the way they had. But I also told them, and meant it fully, that worry built on imagination rarely survives contact with the actual lived truth of a situation, and that I was glad they'd finally gotten to see the truth of it for themselves, instead of continuing to worry about a version of my life that had never actually existed. We talked about it on her terrace, with the San Miguel Bay visible in the evenings, in long phone calls between my trips when I was back in Toronto managing shipments and she was between classes. We mapped out versions of it on actual paper, lists of what each arrangement would cost, what it would require, what it would mean for the business, what it would mean for her stability, what it would mean for my children. I should mention my children here, because I've been avoiding it, which is itself a kind of answer. I have 2 kids from my marriage to Helen. My son, Marcus, was 22 in 2013 and living in Vancouver doing something involving app development that I understood about 40% of and was enormously proud of, regardless. My daughter, Simone, was 19 and in her second year at McGill in Montreal, studying environmental science with an intensity that reminded me more of me than I was always comfortable acknowledging. Helen and I had managed a genuinely decent co-parenting relationship once the actual divorce was complete, the kind where we could be in the same room without tension and could speak honestly to each other about the kids, without it becoming a referendum on the marriage. When I told her I was seriously considering splitting my time between Canada and the Philippines, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "So you found somewhere that interests you more than here?" I told her it wasn't that simple, and she said, "It's usually that simple," and she wasn't entirely wrong. Marcus was supportive in the uncomplicated way that younger people sometimes are about their parents' choices, the way that reads as generosity but is partly just the product of not yet fully understanding how permanently a life can change course. He asked practical questions about time zones and whether I'd still make it back for Christmas, and when I said I was planning to, he said, "Sounds like an adventure," with the easy confidence of someone who hadn't yet lived long enough to understand that adventures are mostly just decisions that haven't finished revealing their consequences yet. Simone was harder. Simone had been, since she was old enough to form opinions, the member of the family most likely to ask what you meant when you said something that sounded reasonable on its surface. She called me from Montreal and asked me, with that measured deliberateness I recognized from my own conversational style, whether I'd thought about what this meant for the business, for Priya, for the people whose livelihoods depended on decisions I was planning to make from 8,000 miles away. I told her I'd thought about it extensively. She asked me to tell her specifically how. So I did, and she listened. And at the end she said, "The plan sounds solid. I'm just not sure you've stress-tested it yet." She was, as she frequently was, about things I'd rather not have been questioned on, correct. The plan, as I'd constructed it in 2014, when I finally committed to trying it, was built around a genuinely appealing logic. I would spend roughly 6 months of the year in the Philippines, primarily in Dumaguete with Clara, and 6 months in Toronto, managing the business through the busier Northern Hemisphere seasons. Priya would have clear authority during my absences, elevated compensation to match that responsibility, and access to me by phone and email for anything she couldn't handle independently. I'd invested in better inventory management software, had shifted the business toward slightly higher margin accounts that required less transactional hand-holding, and had spent nearly a year deliberately making myself less operationally central before I ever got on a plane with the intention of staying longer. That's the plan. I want you to hold it in your mind alongside what actually happened, because the distance between those two things is, more or less, the entire story. The first year was, I'll be honest, mostly fine. I spent 5 months in Dumaguete, came back for the summer and early fall, when the catering industry was predictably busy, went back to Dumaguete in November, and was home for Christmas. Priya managed well. The business held. Clara and I developed an actual daily rhythm together for the first time, cooking breakfast together in her kitchen, me working on the laptop in the mornings while she was at the university, walking along the boulevard in the evenings, the routine of a shared life rather than the heightened attentiveness of an extended visit. I started going to a small gym near her place. I started recognizing people in the market, having the same kind of repeated micro-conversations with the same vendors that accumulate, over months, into something that starts feeling like a version of belonging. I should tell you what Dumaguete is, if you haven't been, because it matters to understanding what I was building my plan around. Dumaguete is a city on the eastern coast of Negros Oriental, sometimes called the City of Gentle People, a nickname that sounds like marketing, but turns out to be a reasonably accurate description of a place that runs at a different tempo than most cities its size. It has 2 universities, which gives it a particular energy, young and intellectual, and a bit chaotic in the way of college towns everywhere, but layered over something older and quieter, a city that's been itself for a long time and isn't particularly in a hurry to be anything else. The boulevard runs along the waterfront, lined with trees and food stalls, and on weekend evenings it fills with families and students and older couples and tourists and vendors selling everything from freshly squeezed juice to hand-carved wooden toys, and the whole thing hums along at a pace that feels, when you've come from a city like Toronto, almost implausibly unhurried. Clara had a small community there that gradually became mine too, the way community works when you're allowed into it by someone who already belongs. Her colleagues at the university, a rotating collection of researchers and artists and writers who gathered most Friday evenings at someone's house or a small restaurant for dinner and an argument about something cultural or political, became people I knew by name and then by temperament, who I'd developed opinions about and mild ongoing debates with on a range of topics I wouldn't have encountered in the world I'd been living in for the previous decade. There was a ceramicist named Ramon, who could argue the political history of indigenous craft traditions for 3 hours without repeating himself. There was a marine biologist named Joe, who was conducting research on coral reef recovery, and who had the useful quality of being completely uninterested in small talk, diving straight into whatever she was actually thinking, with a thoroughness that I found, after years of professional conversations, engineered to avoid the actual point, genuinely refreshing. That first year, I kept telling myself the plan was working, and in a narrow technical sense it was. The business stayed profitable, the relationship deepened, I was healthier, sleeping better, eating better, the kind of better that you don't notice accumulating until someone who knew you before mentions it. My blood pressure, which had been a recurring topic with my doctor in Toronto for years, came down to a range my doctor described, with some incredulity, as impressively ordinary. The second year is where the seams started showing. It wasn't one thing. I want to be clear about that, because when I've told this story to people who know me, there's always a moment where they're waiting for the dramatic event, the single crisis that revealed the flaw in the plan, and that's not quite what happened. What happened was more like what happens to a structure that has a small design flaw, where nothing fails catastrophically all at once, but where a series of individually manageable stresses accumulate in a way that the design never accounted for. The first stress was the time zone. 8 to 13 hours, depending on daylight saving in Canada, which the Philippines doesn't observe. This is a number that sounds like a logistical inconvenience and turns out to be a form of occupational schizophrenia. When my day in Dumaguete was winding down into evening, dinner, the walk along the boulevard, the ease of actual life, Toronto was waking up and needing things. When I was at my most mentally sharp in the early Philippine morning, it was the middle of the night in Ontario, and there was nothing to be done with that sharpness, except worry about the things I couldn't act on for another 7 hours. I started keeping 2 clocks on my phone, which sounds like a tiny adaptation, and turns out to be something you stare at dozens of times a day, in a way that keeps you in a permanent state of mild duality, never fully in the time zone your body is actually in. Priya was excellent at her job. I want to say that clearly, and without qualification, because this story could easily be read as a failure of delegation, and it's more complicated than that. Priya handled the day-to-day operations with more competence than I'd honestly hoped when I'd first mapped out the plan. The problem was not Priya's competence. The problem was that a business is not a static object that maintains itself between interventions. It's a living thing, constantly generating decisions that range in significance from trivial to consequential, and the difference between trivial and consequential is not always obvious from the information available at the moment of the decision. And when the person whose judgment is supposed to make that determination is sitting on a terrace in Dumaguete, watching the sun go down over the Tannon Strait, the mechanism for applying that judgment to a problem in a warehouse in Mississauga develops a delay that no amount of technology fully eliminates. There was a contract negotiation with a hotel group in the 3rd month of my 2nd year's Philippine stretch that I should have been physically present for. I know that now with the clarity of hindsight. At the time, I told myself that the video call would be sufficient, that the relationship was solid enough to hold, that Priya had the terms clearly and could execute them without me in the room. The hotel group's procurement officer was a man I'd done business with for 7 years, a man who knew me, specifically me, and who had, I later understood through careful reading of what happened next, wanted to renegotiate a fundamental aspect of our pricing structure that he hadn't fully disclosed in advance of the call. The kind of renegotiation that happens most productively over a lunch, where you can read someone's face across a table and respond to what they're not saying as much as what they are. We lost that contract. Not dramatically, not with any stated grievance that I could point to and dispute, but quietly, in the way that long-standing business relationships end when someone newer and more present makes a competing offer to a client who's been subtly signaling they need more attention. The revenue loss was manageable. The symbolic loss was something I sat with for a long time on that terrace in Dumaguete, running through the version of events where I'd been in the room, and finding it hard to construct an outcome that went the same way. Clara watched me running those mental simulations one evening and asked, with the directness I'd long since stopped being surprised by, whether I was actually in Dumaguete or whether I was in Mississauga. I told her I was on the terrace. She said, "That's not what I asked," and I didn't have a good answer for her, because she was right that the honest answer was more complicated than my location. The third year was when I added something to the arrangement that I was genuinely excited about at the time, and that turned out to be the development that most clearly revealed the structural problem I'd been slowly building toward. I'd been watching the growth of culinary tourism in the Philippines for several years. The country's food culture was getting international attention in ways it hadn't when I first started coming. Chefs and food journalists and travel writers discovering regional cuisines that had been there all along but were newly accessible to a global audience that had started paying attention. I had relationships with restaurant supply distributors through my Canada business. I understood the supply chain for commercial kitchens. I saw what I thought was an obvious opportunity to open a small supply operation in Cebu, serving the growing number of restaurants and boutique hotels in the Visayas region that were buying equipment from Manila suppliers with long lead times and inconsistent service. Clara didn't tell me it was a bad idea. She asked me, carefully, how I intended to give it the attention it needed when my attention was already divided across 2 countries and 2 time zones, and whether I'd fully calculated what starting a business from scratch would actually require of me in the period before it became self-sustaining, and whether I understood that the Philippines, for all its genuine appeal as a place to live, had its own specific business environment with its own specific requirements and complexities that weren't going to yield to the same approaches that had worked in Ontario. I listened to all of that, acknowledged its validity, and opened the business anyway. I want to be fair to my past self here, because I don't think this was stupidity. Not exactly. I think it was the particular blindness of someone who'd built something successfully once and had therefore developed a, perhaps excessive confidence in their ability to build things successfully again, combined with a genuine enthusiasm for the Philippines that had, over 6 years, shaded into a kind of romanticization that wasn't serving me as clearly as it once had. I was in love with the idea of being rooted in both places, of having built something real in each country, of being the person who'd figured out how to make that genuinely work rather than just holiday in one place while sustaining a career in another. Wyatt Hughes Supply Philippines launched in the spring of my 3rd year, out of a rented commercial space in a light industrial area near the North Reclamation area in Cebu City, with 3 employees, a small initial inventory, and a business plan I'd written with genuine care and a degree of optimism that I now recognize was doing a fair amount of structural work that due diligence should have been doing instead. The first 6 months were genuinely promising. We landed 3 restaurant accounts immediately, one of them a boutique resort that had been waiting for a more responsive local supplier for years. I was in Cebu more than Dumaguete during that period, which Clara absorbed with more grace than I probably deserved, making the 2-hour trip between cities more often than I would have asked her to if I'd been thinking clearly about what I was actually asking. The Cebu business had an energy to it, that particular early energy that a new enterprise generates when the problems haven't yet arrived in sufficient volume to balance out the momentum, and I was running on that energy in a way that felt sustainable in the short term, and wasn't. The problems that arrived over the following year were not dramatic problems. I want to stress that again, because the temptation in telling a story about something not working is to dramatize the failure in a way that makes it feel inevitable and therefore forgivable. The problems were ordinary problems that any new business encounters: cash flow timing mismatches, a supplier relationship that promised lead times and didn't deliver them consistently, an employee situation in my third month that required more direct management than the general manager I'd hired could handle without my physical presence, questions about permits and local business registration requirements that my initial research had addressed in outline and reality had addressed in significantly more complex detail. Each individual problem was solvable. The issue was that I was solving them from a position of constant partial attention, never fully present in either place, always managing one business from the location of the other, always a time zone behind on something, always choosing which fire to respond to first, while the other one burned at a rate I was monitoring on a phone screen rather than with my own eyes. There was a morning, I can place it exactly, a Tuesday in November of my third year, when I was standing in that parking lot outside the warehouse in Mississauga, in a temperature that had dropped overnight to something that a weather app described as feels like -19 with wind chill, on a phone call with my Cebu manager about a shipment problem, while simultaneously watching a text thread with Priya about the hotel contract situation I mentioned earlier, while knowing that I had a flight to Manila booked for Saturday that I was 90% certain I wasn't going to be on, and I had a thought with a completeness and clarity that surprised me. I thought, this is not a life split between two places. This is one life, badly enough managed that it feels like two. I didn't do anything with that thought immediately. I finished the phone call. I went inside and dealt with the shipment situation. I called Clara that evening from Toronto, 9 in the morning her time, and she answered and heard something in my voice before I'd said anything of substance, the way people who know you well hear the shape of a conversation before its content. And she said, "What's happened?" And I said, "Nothing specific. I think I just finally understood something." And she said, "Tell me." And I did. That phone call lasted 4 hours. Clara is many things, but she is not the kind of person who tells you what you want to hear when what you need is something more useful. And the conversation that followed was the most genuinely productive conversation I've had with another person in my adult life. Not because she argued me into a position, but because she asked questions in an order and with a specificity that required me to answer them honestly, and the answers, when I laid them out in sequence, told me something I'd been avoiding knowing. She asked me which life I was actually living when I was at my best. I said the Philippines, without hesitation. She asked me why I was spending 6 months a year somewhere I was not at my best. I started to say it was about the business, and she said, "You've already told me the business isn't better for you being there half the time. Try a different answer." I tried a different answer. The different answer, when I finally got to it, had something to do with identity, with the story I was telling about myself, with the way being the man who ran a successful business in Canada gave me a kind of definition I hadn't fully replaced with anything else when I started spending time in the Philippines. I was clinging to the Canada life not because it was working better, but because I hadn't yet fully decided who I was in its absence. Clara, who has an essentially unlimited tolerance for honest conversation and an essentially zero tolerance for convenient self-deception, said, "You already know who you are in Dumaguete. You just haven't decided yet whether that's enough." I want to tell you about the process of actually making the decision, because I think people who haven't done it imagine that a decision this significant happens in a single moment, a clean break, a before and after, with a clear line between them, and it doesn't happen that way. or at least it didn't for me. It happened over about 8 months of very specific work, financial, legal, personal, and business-related, during which the clarity of what I was moving toward became increasingly obvious, while the practical complexity of getting there remained substantially intact. I started with the business in Canada, because it was the most complicated part, and I knew that starting there meant the rest of the decisions would have to be honest ones, rather than aspirational ones. Priya and I had a conversation that I'd been building toward for months, without quite naming it to either of us, and I told her directly that I was considering transitioning out of an operational role and was interested in exploring what a management buyout or structured ownership transition might look like, if she was interested in that conversation. She was quiet for a moment, in the way someone is quiet when they've been thinking about something for a long time and have just been given permission to think about it out loud. And then she said she'd been wondering for about a year when I was going to figure out what she'd already figured out, which was that the business needed a full-time owner, and she was the only person currently in the building who could actually be that. We spent 6 months working through the structure of a transition, with an accountant and a lawyer, a formal process that was slower and more detailed than I'd have preferred, and exactly as thorough as it needed to be. Priya took over with a phased ownership arrangement, payments structured over 4 years, terms that were fair to both of us, a clean document that protected us both. On the day we signed it, she shook my hand across the conference table in a way that felt like equal parts conclusion and beginning, both of us recognizing that we were starting something new, even as we were formally ending something else. The Cebu business required a different kind of decision. I want to be honest about what I did with that, because the right ending for it was not the one I initially tried to construct. I spent 3 months trying to find a buyer, someone who could step into the role I'd been inadequately occupying and run the thing properly. What I found instead was something more useful, a local business owner in Cebu named Arnold, who had been in commercial kitchen equipment distribution for 15 years and who was interested not in buying the business as I'd structured it, but in absorbing it into his existing operation. Taking on my accounts, my inventory, and 2 of my 3 employees, in exchange for terms that weren't what I'd hoped to walk away with, but were significantly better than the alternative, which was letting a small business slowly exhaust itself under the weight of its founder's divided attention. Signing those papers in Cebu was different from signing the papers in Toronto. The Toronto transaction felt like a proper handover, 2 professionals recognizing a logical conclusion. The Cebu transaction felt more like an admission, not of failure exactly, but of something more specific, the acknowledgement that I had started something without fully understanding the commitment it required, and that recognizing that before it caused more harm was the most honest thing available to me. Arnold was gracious about it, which helped, and the 2 employees who came with the accounts quickly confirmed to me through their visible relief at reporting to someone who was actually present every day that I'd been a better business planner than an actual boss from another hemisphere. I moved to Dumaguete full-time in the spring of my 4th year. I want to describe what that actually felt like, concretely, in the first weeks, because I think the imagined version of that moment, the clean arrival, the exhale, the sense of rightness, doesn't quite match what it's actually like to stop doing something you've done for a long time, even when stopping is the correct decision. I arrived at Clara's with 3 suitcases and a laptop, fewer things than I'd ever had in any address I'd occupied as an adult, and I sat in her living room that first evening and felt, alongside the genuine relief, a particular kind of emptiness that I recognized from other transitions in my life. The space left by a thing you've been doing for so long that its absence takes a while to fill, the way your body keeps waking you up at 6 in the morning for weeks after you retire from a job, because the schedule has lived in your nervous system long enough that it persists after the reason for it has gone. The business noise took a while to quiet. I kept reaching for my phone in the night, the old reflex of checking Toronto emails at Dumaget hours. I kept doing the mental calculation of what time it was in Ontario, even when there was no longer any operational reason to know. Priya called once in my first month, a courtesy call rather than a crisis, just to let me know things were running smoothly and to ask a routine question that she could have answered herself and was asking, I understood, because she was being kind about the transition, giving me a moment of relevance while I built something to replace it with. Clara watched this process with her characteristic patience. She didn't make it a subject of conversation, didn't push me to process it more quickly, just kept building the days normally, the university rhythm, the Friday evening gatherings, the morning walk, the boulevard in the evenings, and let me find my footing in the routine at whatever pace I actually found it, rather than the pace I was performing. I was grateful for that, more than I've probably said to her directly, though she's one of those people who knows what you're grateful for without requiring you to enumerate it. About 2 months in, I started getting involved in something I hadn't planned for, but that turned out to be, in retrospect, the thing that completed the transition in a way that just living there, however well, couldn't have done on its own. Ramon, the ceramicist from the Friday evening group, had been running an informal workshop program for young artists from lower-income families in the city, helping them develop skills that might eventually become viable livelihoods. The funding for the program was inconsistent, managed through a patchwork of small donations and occasional institutional support that required constant maintenance and never quite achieved the stability that would let the program plan more than a few months ahead. Ramon mentioned one Friday evening, almost in passing, that what the program actually needed was someone who understood how to structure a small budget, how to approach potential sponsors systematically, how to turn an ad hoc funding situation into something with enough predictability that you could commit to a full year's programming. I'd spent 23 years building and running a business. I knew exactly how to do those things. I said so, and Ramon looked at me for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who'd heard a lot of offers that didn't follow through, and then said, "Come Thursday, we'll talk." I went Thursday. The workshop space was a large, partially open structure near the university, smelling of clay and paint, a dozen young people ranging from maybe 15 to their mid-20s, working at various stations, the concentrated quiet of people who were serious about what they were doing. I sat with Ramon for an hour and went through what the funding situation actually looked like, which was more complicated than he'd described on Friday, and more solvable than he'd been treating it, partly because he was an artist rather than a business manager, and the structural solutions were simply not in his range of reference. I came back the following week with a document, not a formal proposal, just a framework, a way of thinking about the funding as a system rather than a series of separate asks, a simple methodology for approaching local businesses as sponsors, a calendar that matched fundraising activities to programming commitments in a way that created accountability in both directions. Ramon read it with the focused attention he apparently brought to everything, asked a series of excellent questions, and then said, "Can you stay through the afternoon and explain the budget part to me again?" I stayed through the afternoon, and then the following Thursday, and then the Thursday after that. Within 6 weeks, I was effectively the program's administrative backbone, which was not a role anyone had offered me and not one I'd sought out, but which had assembled itself around the thing I was actually useful for in the same quiet, unrequested way that the right work sometimes finds you when you stop insisting on finding it yourself. There were 17 young people in the program that first year. A girl named Leda, 16 years old, who was the most gifted of them, working in clay with an instinctive three-dimensional thinking that Ramon described as something he saw maybe once a decade. She was also, outside the workshop, quiet, in a way that read as something more than shyness, something you could see responding to structure and encouragement, with a visible relief, the way kids respond when they find a place that takes them seriously. I started talking to her after sessions, at first just casual conversations, and then more deliberate ones, as I understood that she was smart in a way that had gone unencouraged at home, where her family had more immediate concerns than nurturing an artistic talent that didn't have an obvious economic outcome. I helped her apply for a regional youth arts grant, the first formal application she'd ever submitted for anything. We worked on the application for 3 weeks, me learning how local arts funding was structured and what language the evaluators responded to, her learning, apparently for the first time, that her own work was worth the vocabulary required to describe it clearly. The grant came through in the 3rd month, enough to cover materials for a year, and a small stipend that meant she could keep coming to the workshop without the recurring conversation at home about whether it was worth the time. When the notification arrived, she showed me the email on her phone, holding it out to me in the exact way you hold out something you're not quite certain is real yet, and I read it twice, the way I'd apparently been doing with good news in that part of the world. And then I felt the same thing I imagine everyone feels when something they helped someone else achieve arrives as an actual fact rather than a hoped-for possibility. Not pride exactly, something more specific than pride, something like the feeling of having been useful in a way that outlasts the usefulness. Marcus came to visit in my 7th month in Dumaguete. He'd been following the transition with the particular interest of a son watching a parent do something he hadn't expected, curious and supportive in equal measure, and he arrived with the energy of someone who'd built a picture of the place in advance and wanted to test it against the reality. I showed him the city with the particular pleasure of showing someone a place you've come to know genuinely rather than just visited, taking him to the carinderia I went to most mornings, introducing him to Clara, bringing him to a Friday evening gathering where Ramon immediately engaged him in a conversation about technology and craft that went on for 2 hours and left Marcus looking more intellectually engaged than I'd seen him in years. He came to the workshop space on his 3rd day, spent an afternoon watching Leda work and talking with some of the other participants with the easy curiosity of his generation. And on the drive back he said, almost to himself, "This is. Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know these stories ask more of your time than most of what's out there, but I hope it was worth it, and I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the length of this video does. If you want more stories like this one, told the same honest way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from, and I think if this one landed, you'll want to hear where the rest of them go too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.